When the perpetrator remains inside a locked apartment for 4 days with the body of their victim, we are witnessing a profound psychological state known as post-homicide paralysis, where the individual reality has collapsed so entirely that the traditional flight or fight response is replaced by a disturbing stagnant detachment. I'm a licensed professional counselor, and in this episode of The Clinical File, I'll examine the mental health indicators and psychological layers of the Hallie Marie Tobler case. This analysis is based on my speculations, not a diagnosis of anyone involved in this case. The most compelling mental health red flag in this tragedy is the history of escalating domestic violence, specifically a 2025 incident of strangulation, which clinically serves as one of the most significant predictors of future lethality. Why does a person transition from a petty misdemeanor for choking their spouse to a violent multiple stab wound homicide in less than a year? We are looking at a personality profile that likely struggles with extreme rejection sensitivity and a need for total interpersonal dominance that, when threatened, results in a complete loss of impulse control. The shocking reality of this case is that Hallie Marie Tobler lay deceased in her bathroom for nearly 96 hours, while her husband, Dylan Tobler, remained in the living room in a state of self-inflicted medical crisis and psychological withdrawal. The newly released court documents and police statements provide a chilling look into the mind of a man who, when asked by the police what would happen next, simply tapped his chest and said the word jail. This specific detail tells everything about the cognitive state of the suspect following the crime, suggesting a person who was so completely surrendered to his inevitability of his own destruction. We'll analyze how the psychological concept of over-control can lead to such a sudden and violent rupture in a 4-year marriage. The story reached its most critical development on February 10, 2026, when a 23-year-old Dylan Michael Tobler was officially charged with second-degree intentional murder in the Stearns County District Court. Hallie Marie Tobler was not only a 22-year-old wife, but also the daughter of Jeff Johnson, a prominent political figure who was actively campaigning for the Republican nomination for governor of Minnesota. On February 9th, out of respect for the enormity of his loss, Jeff Johnson suspended his campaign indefinitely, marking a tragic end to his political aspirations for the year. The timeline of this case reveals a disturbing gap of silence that began on February 3, 2026, which was the last time anyone outside of that apartment heard from Hallie. A witness who was concerned about the 4-day absence arrived at the apartment on the evening of February 7th. The witness reportedly knocked on the door for 15 minutes before Dylan Tobler finally unlocked it from the inside, revealing a scene that can only be described as a psychological wasteland. Hallie was found in the bathroom, having suffered multiple stab wounds to her chest, upper back, head, and neck, while Dylan was found in a living room with a life-threatening self-inflicted wounds himself. This behavior illustrates a botched murder-suicide dynamic, which often indicates that the perpetrator's ultimate goal was not just the death of their partner, but a total annihilation of the shared reality that they inhabited. Clinically, when a perpetrator survives their own attempt, we often see a strange, hollowed-out version of their personality emerge during police interviews. Dylan Tobler allegedly told investigators that the situation was a mess and admitted he believed it was his fault his wife was dead. This level of understatement, calling a brutal homicide a mess, is a classical defense mechanism known as minimalization, used to shield the ego from the full weight of the monstrous act. If walking through this case gave you a new insight into manipulation, psychopathy, or how trauma can shape behavior, I would love to keep bringing you these breakdowns. Subscribe if you want the next one to land in your feed. That way you'll always have the psychological context ready when the next big case breaks. It's free, it takes 2 seconds, and it helps me keep making content that actually matters. As we look closer at the mental health indicators, we must address the January 2026 court appearance, where Dylan pleaded guilty to disorderly conduct stemming from a June 2025 incident where he choked Hallie. In the field of forensic psychology, strangulation is referred to as the edge of homicide because it's a demonstration of the power to take a life without using a weapon. It's highly likely that Dylan suffered from a fragile narcissistic structure, where any perceived slight or attempt of independence by Hallie was viewed as a life-threatening wound to his own identity. The fact that the crime occurred in a locked apartment during a week of silence suggests the perpetrator was attempting to freeze time and delay the inevitable confrontation with the outside world. The suspect's choice of rather distinctive method that didn't exactly lend itself to anonymity, involving multiple knives and a 4-day stay at the crime scene, suggests a total breakdown of logic. It appears to be another example of a timeless strategy of attempting to outsmart investigators by simply not acknowledging that the crime has happened, which is a hallmark of a deep psychological denial. The legal proceedings have moved quickly, with the judge setting the bail at $3 million on February 10, 2026, a figure that reflects both brutality of the crime and the potential flight risk of a man who was already demonstrated a lack of regard for his own life. The psychological impact of this event on the victim's family, particularly a public figure like Jeff Johnson, adds a layer of secondary victimization where the grief is played out on a public stage. From a clinical perspective, we have to wonder if the suspect felt a sense of inadequacy compared to high-profile family members, leading to the compensatory aggression where he sought to exert the one type of power he felt he had left. The jail comment he made while tapping his chest suggests a man who had already mentally moved into the next phase of his life as a prisoner, showing no fight or defensive posturing. Yet this is another reminder that confidence and competence don't always travel together, as his plan to escape the consequences through self-harm failed, leaving him to face the very reality he tried to destroy. The behavioral indicators here suggest a person who operated with a high degree of emotional dysregulation that was likely hidden behind a quiet exterior. In cases of domestic homicide, the quiet ones are often those who lack the verbal skills to process anger, leading to a buildup of resentment that eventually explodes in a catastrophic manner. The physical evidence of multiple stab wounds to the back and head suggests a high level of overkill, which is a psychological indicator of extreme personal rage or a desire to completely erase the victim's presence. The forensic evidence, including the knife with dried blood found in the bathroom, creates a circle of physical facts that perfectly match the psychological profile of a man who lost control, then spent days staring at the pieces he couldn't put back together. As Dylan Tobler awaits his next court appearance on February 23, 2026, the clinical focus remains on the why of his silence and a terrifying transition from a public dispute to a permanent tragedy. The behavioral patterns established over 4 years of marriage, including the November 2021 wedding, suggest a relationship that may have been characterized by an anxious avoidant attachment dynamic. In such pairings, the perpetrator's fear of abandonment can reach a pathological level where they perceive the partner's potential departure as a literal threat to their survival. This perception can trigger a primal, violent response intended to permanently anchor the partner to them, even if that anchor is a grave. The suspect's calm demeanor when discussing jail with the officers is a chilling reveal of the post-crisis clarity that sometimes follows extreme acts of violence. During this phase, the intense emotional pressure that drove the act has been released, leaving behind a vacuum of personality where the individual appears compliant and oddly helpful to authorities. This shift from extreme aggression to a passive submission is often seen in individuals who utilize violence as a pressure release valve for a psyche that cannot handle internal conflict. The fact that Dylan remained in the apartment until the very moment a witness forced a confrontation suggests a person who was struck in a repetitive loop of checking the body and confirming the permanence of his actions. If this case is making you say people are wild, subscribe so we can keep saying it together. We are witnessing a case where the pattern of recognition skills of friends and family were likely working overtime, yet the sudden escalation proved impossible to intercept in time. The suspect's digital footprint and history of prior domestic incidents will likely provide the final pieces of the puzzle regarding his deteriorating mental state. By analyzing these patterns, we can better understand the psychological anatomy of domestic homicide and the warning signs that often go unnoticed. In many cases of domestic violence that end in homicide, the perpetrator has a history of making their true emotional state appear functional and stable to the outside world. This masking makes the final violent act seem like it came from nowhere, though the internal psychological pressure was likely mounting for years. Understanding the why behind the crime provides the only path forward to prevention for future victims. We must look at the way Dylan interacted with his own self-inflicted injuries as a form of performance art designed to demonstrate his own suffering along the suffering he caused Hallie and her family. This shared pain narrative is a common theme in murder-suicide scenarios, where the perpetrator wants to remain the protagonist of the story even in death. However, his survival has forced him into a new role where he must now witness the wreckage he created from the isolation of a prison cell. The behavioral clues also point toward a specific type of intimacy-seeking violence, where the perpetrator believes that by killing the partner, they are preserving the relationship in the current state forever. This distorted logic is often found in individuals with borderline personality traits or severe attachment disorders who can't tolerate the ambiguity of an ending. The clinical file will stay open as we monitor the trial and the subsequent psychological evaluations that will undoubtedly be a part of the defense strategy. The memory of Hallie Marie Tobler is now part of a larger conversation about domestic safety and the psychological underpinnings of violent crime in America during the early part of 2026. Her life was cut short in a manner that defies logic, yet follows a chilling, predictable clinical path of domestic abuse and final lethal control. We must remain vigilant in our analysis of these cases to ensure the psychological motives are never buried alongside the victims of senseless acts. The behavioral clues we have discussed today serve as a primary framework for understanding one of the most significant true crime cases of the year so far. It's such a tragedy to hear a young couple, they were not married that long, they were very young, the daughter of a well-known politician who was running for governor, currently running for governor, and she was killed by her husband. This is a stark reminder that domestic violence is often hidden behind closed doors. You're not going to be able to spot domestic abuse easily because they hide it. The ones that are suffering now are the spouses, not just the wife, but sometimes the husband will suffer in silence. And if you are struggling in that, or maybe a friend confided in you of a spouse that's manipulative or maybe narcissistic, talk about it. Help them get help from a therapist. You've got to make and take action on this and not risk something like this happening to them. So what did you think about this case of Hallie? Were there any elements that stood out to you? Thank you for joining me today. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe.